welcome to church. Welcome to church. It's so good to see everybody. So good to be together. It's so good to be the people of God, isn't it? That gather in this way. Man, if I haven't a chance to meet you, my name is Sean, and I'm the ministries pastor here at the church, oversee just a variety of ministries. Such an honor to do that. Man, Brantford, we always say this, and you legitimately are this. You're awesome at welcoming everybody, and so can we just 9 different locations, one church. Can we just take a second and welcome? Welcome. And welcome everybody else. We love you guys. So glad we get to do this in this way. Well, listen, I legitimately am excited about this Sunday. I'm not going to be up here very long. I'll use that as kind of a quick, word of anticipation. I'm so excited about this Sunday. We started a teaching series last week. Justin kicked it off called Sons and Daughters, if you were here. If you weren't, make sure you catch up because we're taking a look at this idea of the people of God have peculiar attributes. You remember we started talking about that? There are peculiar attributes of the people of God. And the first one that we looked at was, what does it mean to be a people of the book? Right, that in a lot of ways, this is where we kicked it off and started saying that in a lot of ways, to be the people of God seems to operate with a life and a life pattern that is kind of countercultural, in many ways counterintuitive. Right, and so to be the people of the book, like we started last week and kind of said to radically orient your life around the truth of God as revealed in His Word is a little peculiar in our day. Right, and so to say that this is the source of truth for my life, that there is design for my life, it's revealed in His Word, that there is a path for my life revealed in His Word, that's peculiar in our day. But it is a huge part of what it means to be sons and daughters of God by faith in Jesus Christ. And so we're continuing that series this week, Peculiar Attributes of the People of God, by saying this, that to be sons and daughters of God by faith in Jesus Christ is to be a people that both are of the margins and go to the margins. Right? That we're of the margins and we go to the margins. Right? Like there's this invitation constantly that's being put in front of us by culture and the world around us to in 1,000 ways make life about us in one sense, and then maybe on the other end of the spectrum to kind of acquiesce to what everybody else is doing with their life and become like everybody, to find meaning and purpose and life in the way that everybody else is finding life and meaning and purpose in it. So to be a people in the margins is going to seem peculiar. It's going to feel at times to be peculiar. But we're a people that are drawn to the margins. We're going to talk about that a little bit this morning. Drawn to the margins, of the margins, to the margins. It means that there's an awful lot of people in this world that on the daily, that God cares about paying attention to, that an awful lot of people do not. And God is calling us to do that. You know, there's a passage of scripture in Acts chapter 3 where 2 of Jesus' followers, Peter and John, some of you know maybe this story, but Peter and John they're going up to the temple to pray, and they come across a crippled guy who was begging. And this is a guy who had been brought there by his friends every single day for years, with tons of people just sort of passing him by, right, day after day. But the love of God in Christ, in Peter and John, caused Peter to stop. And the text tells us that Peter stops, and it says he directed his gaze at him. So a guy that's begging, right, day in and day out, Peter stops and he directs his gaze at him. He saw him. He really saw him, and so he stopped. He didn't continue to go past this guy like this guy was used to day in and day out. He stops, and he's drawn toward him and not away. This is what it means to be a people who are drawn to the margins. Part of the reason why I love this weekend is this is global. If you didn't know that, this is Global Missions Weekend. It's a time where we set aside this weekend as a church to draw our attention and our gaze to those people groups and areas in the world that God has called us to draw our attention to in global mission. Not just here at home, but globally. What is God doing globally in this world? And so we want to pay attention to those things. Where has God told us to focus our giving, our efforts, our attention? Well, about 3 years ago, We started this process of literally asking God by His Spirit to reveal that to us. God, we're a church. We're growing kind of like crazy. Where would you have us get our eyes off of ourselves and look at your global work? We started asking that. And so God directed us over a period of time with a bunch of us coming together from different ones of us, different campuses, formation of a global missions council to focus in 5 areas. And some of you remember those, some of you don't. You haven't been here all that. I just want to reorient you to those 5 target areas. Here's the first one. God directed us to pay attention to church planting around the world and theological training, believing that healthy, strong churches are the hope of the world. So church planting and theological training. Second one is least access to the gospel. That there are 3.5 billion people in the world of the 8 billion that have difficult, little, or no access to the gospel. That's crazy to think about in an information age, but it's real and it's true. And so where are those areas? God, we want to connect there. The third one is extreme poverty. God calls us to take a look at where are those areas of most extreme poverty, and the area where there's the greatest concentration of extreme poverty in this world is in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not the only place, but it's the greatest concentration where access to clean water, to education, to health care, to a stable food supply is difficult at best. So extreme poverty. This fourth area that we've kind of sensed God leading us to is that evangelistically, spreading the gospel, seeing a gospel infusion into places of cultural influence. We called it the arena of ideas. So your major areas of cultural influence, like education, major areas of cultural influence like government, like entertainment, and saying, God, what would you do to establish a gospel presence in these spheres of major influence? The last one, number 5, is where we're going to spend some of our time this morning. It's in the exploitation of women and children around the world. This is an area of massive need. And about 2 to 3 years ago, God really laid it on the hearts of our leaders to invest in and begin partnerships with 2 distinct organizations that had literally given their life, their mission, their very existence to how do we combat this really dark and difficult challenge in our world, the exploitation and trafficking of women and children. And so we began to throw our weight behind these 2 organizations in particular. This is a massive issue. And man, there are few margins, I think, more worth taking our gaze and fixing it on than what happens in these margins. It's why we've invited this morning, we're the co-founder of one of these organizations that Vox has looked to kind of throw their weight behind in a variety of different ways. Co-founder of Love 146, Rob Morris. Would you welcome here this morning?
Good morning, Vox. Wow, lively. Really appreciate being here. This has been such a great weekend, being able to be around folks who are impacting the world, which is a reflection of what Vox is doing as far as impacting the world, the reach that you have. I don't know if you completely understand the reach that you have, but this weekend, getting a glimpse of that is such an encouraging and powerful and beautiful thing. So thank you for adopting Love 146 several years ago as one of your global missions partners. We appreciate that. I think one of the things, as you just heard Sean say, one of the things that I really appreciate about the way you've made decisions on identifying global partners, the intentionality that you've put into that. You haven't just sort of like, hey, we'll do this, we'll do that, but there's been a real intentionality about that, and it's such a powerful and beautiful thing. There's a civil rights leader from way back by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois, and he made a statement like this. He said, "There is but one coward on earth, and that is the coward who dare not know." And I think that instinctively in all of us, when we hear about horrific things happening in the world, there's a part of us that wants to bury our head in the sand. It's just painful. It breaks your heart. It shreds you. And so there's that part of us that doesn't want, I don't even want to know. I can't even hear this right now. And so I love that statement when he says, man, it takes courage to not say, I'm going to look away. It takes courage to say, I want to know, I want to see. And then there's a Jewish historian by the name of Yehuda Bauer, and he made this statement concerning the Holocaust, but I think it's applicable. He said this, he said, three new commandments should be added to the 10 existing ones, is what he said. And he said, these commandments look like this: thou shalt not be a victim. Secondly, thou shalt not be a perpetrator. And then he said, thirdly, which is the most important of all, thou shalt never, ever be a bystander. And so I think if we think about that as a church and as the people of God, what is required of us, it's not enough to just say, I want to know. I'm not going to turn around. I'm going to have the courage to see. But then, now what do I do? And so thank you, Vox, for not only having the courage to see, but actually saying, we're in, we're all in, we're going to do something about this, and you've done that through your generosity. So very quickly, Love 146, those of you that are not aware, we are an international human rights organization working to end the trafficking and exploitation of children. That is our vision. That's what our hope is. That is what our goal is. That's what you are a part of as a church. The organization started 20 years ago when myself and a couple of friends, we started hearing about this thing called human trafficking or child trafficking. And we were like, what in the world is that? And we were shocked as we began to educate ourselves to find out what was actually happening in the world, specifically to children. And then our natural inclination then was, what can we do about this? We had started educating ourselves. We connected with an organization that is made up of criminal investigators and attorneys who work in some of these issues, bringing justice into these dark places. And they said, look, if you're going to do something about it, you really need to understand it. They invited us to one of their operating centers in a Southeast Asian country. We went with them, and when we got there, they were actually in the middle of an investigation in a local brothel. And what these investigators do is they go in undercover, they pose as customers, they have undercover surveillance equipment on, they gather evidence, and then they bring that evidence to local law enforcement. They actually have to do a separate investigation of local law enforcement to try to find people that are not corrupt or getting paid by brothel managers or traffickers to look the other way. And so there's several things going on. Anyway, so they go in, they gather this evidence, and so they were going in this particular night that we were there. They invited us in. We would never recommend anyone do this. We were not professional investigators at all, but because of the relationship and the trust that we built, they invited us in, and we were like, no worries. And they gave us these brief instructions before we went in on how to pose as the very thing that everything in me is completely and utterly repulsed by. And I remember the last thing this investigator said before we went in, he said, look, if you don't think you could do this, if you don't think you can hold it together, do not go in, because we can't risk you breaking character and then destroying this investigation. And we were like, no problem, until we got in there. We found ourselves standing in a room, looking through these glass windows, and on the other side of the glass, these young girls were waiting to be purchased. And we're standing in a room shoulder to shoulder with people who were about to purchase these kids, and the words of that investigator were going through my head. If you don't think you can hold it together, because everything in me, as a man, as a father, as a human being, wasn't doing a great job in holding it together. Everything wanted to react in that situation, and we couldn't do that so that the investigation can be completed. And I think the thing that so took my breath away was the looks in the eyes of these children. They were sitting there motionless, watching children's cartoons on television sets. And they all had this sort of that motionless stare watching these children's cartoons, except for one girl. And I will never forget her face. I'll never forget those eyes. She was the only one not looking at the children's cartoons. She was staring at us in our direction through the glass. And I don't know what I was seeing in her eyes. I don't know, because I'm just an observer. Was it panic? Was it trauma? Was it fight? Was it defiance? I had hoped it was defiance. But I will never forget that gaze. And the number that she wore was 146. And so when we started the organization, we wanted to remind ourselves that we're not talking about issues and causes, but we're talking about individual human beings, individual image bearers of God that we're talking about. I think sometimes we can dehumanize people by putting them under categories of people, right? The unreached, right? We're talking about human beings, not just a group of people, the unreached or the homeless, the poor, the refugees. These are human beings. These are image bearers of God. And so even when we started the organization, it's to remind us of that. And so that's when we started, and then we were like, okay, we walk away from that situation of like, now what do we do? Long story short, we eventually started Love 146. We started doing survivor care. We started caring for survivors, specifically in Asia, and then after doing it there for a while, we ended up doing survivor care in the UK, and then eventually here, because it happens here too, in the US. And that was an afterthought. We didn't know that. And then we started doing the research, and it actually is something that happens here. And so providing survivor care here in the US as well. And then after doing survivor care for some time, we recognized that we're not going to end this by caring for survivors alone. We have to do something to stop it from happening. And we developed our prevention programs, which now looks like a curriculum. So, and just to give you some context, survivor care here, just in the state of Connecticut, we've been able to provide direct services to over 700 children just in our state who have either been victims, confirmed victims, or suspected victims of trafficking. That's huge, 700 kids just in the small state of Connecticut, which gives you an understanding of how horrendous this situation is. And then our prevention education curriculum now is being utilized in 28 states throughout the country, in public schools, in juvenile justice agencies, with child welfare agencies. And so since 2002, we've been able to reach over 70,000 children on 4 continents through prevention and through survivor care. That's what you make possible. So thank you, again, for engaging in a meaningful way and refusing to be bystanders. This morning, I wanted to talk a little bit about hope, because it's easy to become overwhelmed when you see the needs of the world. You know, even this weekend and listening to some of the partners and everything in the areas that they work and people in the trenches doing hard work, you start to get overwhelmed at the realities that are all around us. And I remember some years ago, I was with a friend of mine, we were having dinner. And as we were having dinner, at one point we were in a restaurant, and I was having a hard time seeing the menu, because that's what happens after you get a little older. And so I have these, my magnifying glasses and everything, so I'm reading the menu and everything, and he just laughed at me. He's like, oh, you need those now, huh? And I'm like, yeah, I do. I said, that's not the only thing. I said, I've lost almost all the hearing in my right ear and stuff, so even in conversations with people and stuff, you'll notice that sometimes I have to turn my head. I'm not ignoring you or whatever, I'm actually having to try to hear you, and so I'm like, I'm losing my hearing, I'm losing my stuff. And then we just started laughing as we realized, oh my gosh, we're those guys now. We're those old guys in a restaurant complaining about how our bodies are failing us and falling apart and everything. And I was like, yeah, but you know what else is happening? And this I can't explain. Is at the same time it seems like that kind of thing is happening, something else is happening internally in me that I'm starting to pay attention to, in that, man, hope seems to be rising inside of me. And I can't really explain why that is, but I know that everything else should be telling me differently. That, man, how can you be hopeful? How can you be hopeful in what the world is becoming? How can you be hopeful in the work that we do when we're immersed in some of the darkest stories imaginable? But man, this is my reality. Somehow hope is rising. And I'm like, what is that? I need to identify what that is and how that's happening. And so we've kind of come to a place as an organization that we've discovered there's 2 kinds of hope that we understand as an organization. One of those is what we call deferred hope. A hope, the thing that you're longing for, not coming to pass. And the other thing is what we call defiant hope. And I want to talk about those 2 forms of hope this morning. By the way, that thing that you saw up on the screen with that QR code, before I forget, something magical happens. I'm not a tech person, but something magical happens when you point your camera at that. It brings you to some portal that tells you all about the organization, how you can be involved, and we have information available for that as well. See, there it is. So yeah, if you want to know what more can you do, how you can get involved, that's a great place to start. There's phenomenal resources there, internet safety guides for kids, for parents, and all of that. So Psalm 40, verse 1. This is such an interesting psalm to me. The psalmist says this: I waited and waited and waited for God. Can you feel that? He could have very easily just written, I waited for God. But can you feel an ache there? He's like, I waited. and I waited. And I waited for God. How many of you have ever been in that place where it's that thing it becomes a longing, it becomes an ache. That thing that you're looking for an answer for is not coming to pass. You're longing and aching for justice, it's not coming to pass. You're longing and you're aching for resolve, it's not coming to pass. And that's sort of like you hear the psalmist all through the Psalms doing the whole, how long, O Lord? How long will you hide your face from me? How long will you not answer me? And you feel this aching and this waiting and waiting and waiting. And that is what we call a hope deferred. Proverbs 13:12 says it this way: hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. We would love to just jump to the second part of this verse, right? A longing fulfilled. That's the place I want to live and everything. But here's the reality. A lot of us, real life experience, are in the heart sickness realm. We live in that realm of like, man, the thing that I'm aching for and longing for isn't coming to pass. The word deferred means postponed or put off. You know, and we could think of a million ways that this expresses itself. I mean, our family has been involved in adopting children. We've built our family in so many ways by, through adopting children. And it's been such a life-changing experience in so many ways. But we've been, as people who have done that, we know what waiting is all about. And what happens during that waiting and the longing to bring this child into your family. And oftentimes it takes years to do that. I remember my wife and I one time talking through this and like, man, it feels like so much it has to do with this waiting. And we're aching and longing and it doesn't seem to be happening. There's red tape and paperwork and phone calls. And by the way, this is not passive waiting. This is active waiting, right? You're doing something during that time, but you're still waiting for the thing to come to pass. And then one day we were like, imagine what it feels like to be the child waiting. What does that feel like? There's a whole category in adoption world called waiting children. It's an actual, you go to adoption websites or a foster care web, and you'll see waiting children. And often children fall into that category because they're older children, or because they're of disabilities or sibling groups, because not a lot of people are lining up to adopt those children. And so they become waiting. There should never be a category of children called waiting children, but it's the reality that we live in. So that waiting piece is a huge thing. And during that time, oftentimes we become heartsick. In the work that we do at Love 146, we see this heart sickness in children waiting for justice. I remember one child who was waiting for 4 years to see the perpetrator that had committed the crimes against her found, and then finally found, and then more years waiting for that person to come to some sort of justice and everything. And when it finally happened, she says, I feel like somebody finally pulled a thorn out of my heart. She had lived in this place of heart sickness. I remember visiting a safe home one year, and there was a girl who was so traumatized. She would spend her days at the edge of the safe home property, sitting in a pile of dirt, taking handfuls of dirt and pouring dirt over her head, wanting to disappear into the ground. I can't even imagine that level of trauma and the heart sickness that is connected to that. I remember a therapy session that one of our counselors did in the Philippines in our work there with the girls, where she would do this exercise where she'd have the girls walk down this pathway through the safe home property. And she says, I want you to picture your future. What do you see? And one of the first signs of recovery beginning to take place for a lot of the kids that we work with is when they can dream again about a future. Because oftentimes, when you ask a child, what do you want to be when you grow up, that's come into our care, there's this complete, I don't even know what that means. If I survive today, then that's a good day. And so there's no sense of a future or tomorrow. So when a child is able to say, I want to be a social worker, or I want to be a teacher, or I want to do this or that, we celebrate that. And so one at a time, these children would walk down this pathway through our safe home property. And one girl in particular walks through the pathway, and she says, I picture myself turning 18. One day, I'm going to reach 18 years old. She never thought that she would ever hit the age of 18. What sort of heart sickness is that? Wondering if I'm going to live that long. And then she goes, and maybe people will even notice it because I've never had a birthday celebration in my life, and maybe people will celebrate me turning 18. Another girl walks down the pathway. She goes, I dream of walking down another pathway one day, getting an education, and walking down the aisle to get a diploma. That's my dream. That's my heart. And then a third girl walks down the pathway. She stopped halfway. She closed her eyes and pretended to hold a bouquet of flowers in her hand. And she says, I dream of a wedding day. She goes, maybe someday somebody will love me and care about me the way I should be loved and cared about and value me the way I should be valued. And then later on, the most heartbreaking thing was when this girl talked to the counselor and said, do you really think that's ever going to happen for me? When anyone finds out what has happened in my life and what has taken place, is anybody going to desire me? Is anybody going to really value me? That's the heart sickness piece of what we're talking about here. For the last 20 years or so, since we've been doing this work, I've been on this quest then to try to figure out, how do we keep hope alive in the midst of the heart sickness? How do I keep my heart from getting sick? Not just in the waiting, but in what feels like a raging storm outside, what feels like a gathering darkness. Don't you last night I was up during the night with the storm, right? Anybody else? And it's just like, wow, this is perfect. I couldn't have ordered this in a better way. There's this storm raging outside, and we're going to talk about that today. But there is this sense of this raging storm, what seems like increasing violence, increasing terrorism, despair, cynicism, racism, all the isms that are happening. Robert Benson, the author, he describes it this way: we find ourselves caught somewhere between the dreaming and the coming true. And so in reflecting on this raging storm concept, I was reminded about my grandfather. My grandfather went to sea when he was about 17 years old and spent a lot of his younger years as a sailor on these big, tall ships. And I remember loving sitting at my grandfather's feet and him sharing stories about life at sea. His stories were phenomenal. I would just, tell me more. And I remember one story in particular that he would tell, and I wanted him to tell it over and over again, where there was a storm raging so badly that he was steering the ship. They had to actually tie him to a post so that the waves that were crashing over the ship wouldn't sweep him off of the ship. And this picture as a kid growing up of my grandfather tied to the trying to steer the ship through a storm just blew me away. And I started looking at my family history, and it turns out I have a lot of people that come from the sea in my family. There's a little fishing village in Advocate Harbor, Nova Scotia, where many of my relatives are buried. And you'll see on the headstones, Captain William Morris and First Mate Michael Morris. And there's all these more, and I always kind of had this pride of like, I come from the sea, I don't. I'm actually in Hamden, Connecticut, but it's sort of a pride thing in a good way. But I've always been fascinated by that. I've loved reading the books, Old Man and the Sea, Hemingway's book, and Moby Dick, and Shackleton's Voyages, and all of that. And in my reading about this stuff, I stumbled upon a kind of mariner that you found in ancient Greece. And his title or his position on the old ships in ancient Greece was called the archegos. And you know how you have different people in different positions on a ship. You have the captain, you have the first mate, you have the navigator, you have the cook. Well, there was a guy in ancient Greece called the archegos. And the word archegos is translated trailblazer, pioneer. Sometimes it's translated as captain or even author, okay? What the archegos' job was on the ship was, if the ship got caught in a storm and it needed to get safely into a harbor, oftentimes what would happen was the ship wouldn't make it into the harbor. It would run aground on the rocks. Sometimes even within sight of the safety of land, it would run into the rocks, and it would literally be beaten to pieces by the raging storm and the sea. And when that was happening, what would take place is they would call up the archegos. This was his only job on the ship, was he was the strongest swimmer on the ship. They would call up the archegos, and what they would do is they would tie a rope around his waist and tie another rope around something on the ship, and he would dive into the raging stormy sea and swim like mad to try to make it to shore. And if he made it to shore, he would take the rope and he would tie it onto something solid on the shore, whether it was a rock or a tree or something like that, which created a lifeline, literally, to the other people on the ship, who at this point in time are hovering under the decks of the ship, scared to death, knowing we're going to die here. Can you imagine being the archegos and having that job? I mean, that's like the very thing that's terrifying everybody else, causing them to sit under, hover under the decks of the ship. He's diving into it. He's facing it. That's more than courage, man. That's what I would call defiance, right? Almost a defiant hope in so many ways. And that was the archegos' job. So this thought captured me of defiant hope. Here's the problem, is the word defiance has a bad rap, right? it has this negative connotation. If I often tell people, if I had $1 for every time I heard the word defiance, connected to me when I was growing up by school teachers or even my parents, you're such a defiant young man, you're so defiant. Well, let me tell you something. Since I've been able to connect that defiance to hope, it's paying off in spades, man. Defiant hope. There's a defiance. And it's not optimism. I have some people, they'll meet me or something like that, and they'll be like, hey, we love your optimism. And I'm like, you don't know me, because I'm not an optimist by any sense of the imagination. I wish I was an optimist, but I've seen way too much to be optimistic. And I think, and I'm not anti-optimist, so if you're an optimist, don't feel bad. I like being around optimists, in fact. But sometimes optimism can turn into a place of passivity, where it's just like, it's bad, but it's all going to work out. Everything's going to be okay. I'm not that person, okay? Sometimes it even moves close into denial realm, right? Where it's like denial of what's actually happening around us. But I am hopeful, and I'm defiantly hopeful, and I think the difference is defiant hope has action connected to it. It's active, it's not passive. It says, yeah, things are really bad, but I insist that it can change, and it can possibly change by my action. Me actually doing something about it, and then I engage. And so that's what we call defiant hope. It's a pushing back. It's an insistence against despair and growing cynicism and darkness and all of that. So how do we learn this? And how in the world can we become defiantly hopeful people? First, I think, honestly, I have a bit of an advantage in that back in 1960, my parents had a child. And then in 1961, they wanted to have another child. But in 1961, those of you that are old enough to remember, you'll remember that we were in the middle of something called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so my parents were terrified, and as everybody else was, that the end of the world could potentially happen at any time. And so they were like, man, we really want another baby. Do we really want to bring a baby into this world right now? And then the thought of, like, we have limited resources to begin with. And so President Kennedy at the time, and you could Google this, President Kennedy at the time was encouraging Americans to, if you have extra money, buy a bomb shelter. Have a bomb shelter in your backyard or whatever, just in case. In fact, at that time, you could actually buy a bomb shelter out of the Sears Roebuck catalog, right? So my parents were in this place of debating, like, oh man, bomb shelter, baby. Bomb shelter, baby. They weren't sure what. Thank God my parents gave in to defiant hope. They decided we're going to have a baby and bring life into this world. That baby ended up being me. So I wouldn't be here if my parents were not defiantly hopeful. So I have it sort of a genetic disposition toward defiant hope. Maybe you don't have that, so I'm sorry. Secondly, I think a way that defiant hope can become a reality in us is by looking for the human trailblazers of hope that are all around us. We have those historic figures like the Mandelas of the world, the Martin Luther King Jr.'s of the world, the Wilberforces, the Malalas, the John Lewises, and all that. I spent this weekend with archegoses of hope. I mean, people that are in different parts of the world in the trenches bringing hope and life to people who are desperate for some sort of hope and life. And so there's people in this room. There's somebody sitting next to you that is potentially an archegos of hope. So there's examples around us that we can look to, sometimes even in the most unlikely places. I mean, I find archegoses of hope even sometimes in my children and the kids that we work with. I want to show you this quick picture here. This was taken back in when we were adopting one of our children from Vietnam. She was 4 years old, and we were in Vietnam for 3 weeks, and we were staying in this hotel. She was with us right from the beginning, so she was with us during that 3-week period of time. And we would take her, when you walk into the hotel room, you take your shoes off, and when you leave the hotel room, you put your shoes on. And so at night, we would put our shoes next to the door. And in the morning, I would wake up, and this is what I would see. And what was happening, we were like, what in the world? I told my wife, did you put her shoes in my, and she was like, no. So one night, we stayed up to figure out what is going on. And what would happen is in the middle of the night, my daughter would take her little shoes, and she would plant them in my shoes as a sign of, like, I am not going to be forgotten again. I'm not going to be left behind again. That's a defiant, do you feel? I mean, it's a defiant level of hope that is such a powerful thing. So even I'm learning this from my own kids and even the kids that we journey with. For many of the children in our care, for them to wake up in the morning and choose to live another day is an act of defiant hope. So on and on it goes. But here's the bottom line. Human examples are oftentimes not enough to keep hope alive or prevent heart sickness. Am I right? So there's another place to go. And here we go. This is mind-blowing to me, you guys. Acts chapter 3, verse 15. This is after the example that Sean just gave earlier. Remember Peter and John at the gate, and the person saying, man, please, do you have any money? And they're like, we don't have anything on us, but you know what? This is what we do have. In the name of Jesus, rise up and walk, and you know the story. And then a crowd gathers, right? This happens all the time. People gather around. And I love Peter. Peter's so bold. Oh, there's a crowd. So he goes for it. And this is a pretty bold statement to say. He goes, and you killed the author of life, whom God raised from the dead. To this we are witnesses. You killed the author of life. You guys, the word author there is from the original Greek, archegos. The word archegos shows up in the Bible 4 times as a description of Jesus. Next verse, Acts chapter 5, verse 31. God exalted him at his right hand as leader and savior to give repentance to Israel and forgiveness of sins. The word leader comes from the word archegos. And Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10, for it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. The word founder is the Greek word archegos. And then in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer, the archegos and perfecter of faith, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. 4 times the word archegos is seen in the Bible to describe Jesus. What a picture of Jesus. Think about it. What is incarnation when we celebrate Christmas? Isn't it the archegos of heaven? Looking at the mess that we've created, and instead of being a far-off God and disconnected, man, he immerses himself into the madness. He immerses himself into the craziness of our sin and what we have created, and shows up in the poverty of a stable to a poor family, to the marginalized. It's such a radical picture of the archegos of Jesus. And then we just celebrated Easter, right, where we talk about the crucifixion being that rope, the cross being that rope, and the empty tomb of like, there is a way now that I have created, a way that is marked by defiant hope. You know, this morning I came in here and I'm thinking, maybe there's some of you that you feel shipwrecked by heart sickness. You're overwhelmed by what feels like a strengthening storm in your own life. I want to encourage you to look to Christ, who has already gone before. He is the trailblazer of hope. He is the author of life, and he is the captain of our salvation. Oh, captain, my captain. If you find yourself in that place of longing, aching, waiting, heart sickness, and perhaps maybe even in fear, because that's what happens, of what feels like this gathering storm, there is a hope found in the archegos of heaven. Margaret Wheatley said, hopelessness is not the opposite of hope, fear is. And in the midst of what looks like a raging storm all around us, right? You hear it all the time, man, our world is just sinking, right? I've heard people describe it as like a sinking ship. We're going down, man. We're going down. The church should not be cowering under the decks of the sinking ship, waiting for the rapture, or isolating ourselves from the pain of our neighbors, or worse, living in fear of the other. I don't think it's enough to be resting in the fact that we have an archegos that's gone before us and made a way. We have a responsibility and a call to become trailblazers of hope ourselves for those all around us, caught in their own storms of longing and for some kind of hope. And here what if as sons and daughters, we were marked by this kind of defiant hope? When that happens, anything can happen. In closing, I've had the extraordinary privilege of being able to see a girl that one day dreamt that she would turn 18, hit 18, and we celebrated her birthday like there was no tomorrow. I have had the extraordinary opportunity to be able to see a girl who dreamt of getting an education walk down that aisle at her high school graduation, go on to college, and she's got a certificate now that enables her to work with other kids who've been through what she's been through. I've gotten to see a young lady who closed her eyes and squeezed them shut, hoping that one day she would be valued and loved the way she should be loved and valued, end up meeting an amazing person who is loving her and valuing the way that she should be loved and valued. I met a girl in a safe home some time ago. She came running up to me, and she was trying to tell me something in a language that I don't understand or speak. And as she was, I couldn't understand her, so she's giggling and all excited. I bring over one of the caregivers. I said, "Can you tell me what she's trying to tell me?" And she comes over, and she listens, and she got this smirk on her face, and she goes, "Rob, she wants to teach you to dance." You guys, I don't dance, all right? It's not a pretty thing at all. But when children like this ask you to dance, you dance. And I remember that afternoon we were spending the time, she's teaching me the moves to this Cambodian traditional dance, and I'm trying to mimic the moves, attracting the attention of other kids in the safe home till they all kind of are gathering around, laughing and pointing at the awkward white guy trying to look graceful. And I was so moved, and later on I asked the caregiver about this young girl. I said, "Tell me her story." And she told me her story, and it was horrific. But she goes, "Rob," this little girl, just a year ago, would spend her days at the edge of the safe home property, sitting in a pile of dirt, trying desperately to disappear into the ground. And you guys, it was the same girl that I had met a year before, unrecognizable because of the transformation. Do you believe in a God who brings beauty from ashes? I do. I've seen it happen. And here's the crazy, beautiful thing of it all, is that he uses people like you and I. I want to close by reading these words to a very familiar song. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ, the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. When darkness veils his lovely face, I rest on his unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. His oath, his covenant, his blood supports me in the whelming flood. When all around my soul gives way, he then is all my hope and stay. On Christ, the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. Let's pray together. I'm going to pray a prayer by a guy named Ted Loader, but I think it's appropriate to close this morning off. Sometimes, Lord, it just seems to be too much violence, too much fear, too much of demands and problems, too much of broken dreams and broken lives, too much of war and slums and dying, too much of greed and squishy fatness and the sounds of people devouring each other and the earth. Too much of stale routines and quarrels, unpaid bills and dead ends. Too much of words lobbed in to explode and leaving shredded hearts and lacerated souls. Too much of turned away backs and yellow silence, red rage and the bitter taste of ashes in my mouth. Sometimes the very air seems scorched by threats and rejection and decay until there's nothing but to inhale pain and exhale confusion. Too much of darkness, Lord. Too much of cruelty and selfishness and indifference. Too much, Lord. Too much. Too bloody, bruising, brainwashing much. Or is it too little? Too little of compassion. Too little of courage, of daring, of persistence, of sacrifice. Too little of music and laughter and celebration. Oh God, make of me some nourishment for these starved times, some food for my brothers and sisters who are hungry for gladness and hope, that being bread for them, I may also be fed and be full. Amen. Let's worship together.